Hi, this is the second part to a much longer reaction. If you haven't seen it yet, links to it are in the description as well as the top corner of the video. Now with all that out of the way, let's continue with this then, shall we?
James Randi, someone who is a personal hero of mine, was an illusionist who spent the later half of his year debunking what he referred to as woo-woo mysticism. Psychics, faith healers, healing crystals, people who claim to have some sort of magical power beyond the realms of known physics. He is most famed for his fiery takedown of one Uri Geller, the famous faith healer and televangelist Peter Popov, and of course the $1 million paranormal challenge, which offered a cash prize of $1 million to anyone capable of proving they have a psychic ability under laboratory conditions, which remains unclaimed to this day. One of Randy's more interesting lectures was that you cannot prove Santa Claus does not exist. After all, we can scour the North Pole and find no evidence of any gigantic workshop full of elves.
They're invisible.
We can throw reindeer off a roof and prove that they cannot physically fly. But those are normal reindeer, and every idiot knows that Santa's reindeer are specially bred reindeer who can fly because of pixie dust, which, though that is a childish description, it's probably a special ancient medicine made from all natural ingredients which has been lost to time outside of this one recipe, handed down through generations and generations of Santa Clauses unknown to science, who is too busy with their microscopes and their chemicals to understand the miracle of nature, etc., etc. You get the picture. The point is, to any believer, there is no proving them wrong. Everything can be explained away, and everyone trying to stop you is either ignorant of the truth or in on the whole thing and trying to stop you finding out the real truth. So any evidence
of course he uses flat earthers as the example,
That is how Putin sees the world around him. This is how he thinks, and the life he leads within the Kremlin's fortified walls has been designed through generations of supreme rulers to protect its members from having to interact with reality. Because if you can't see reality, then what reality is can always be easily dictated to you. We should really talk about what color revolution...
I mean, so at that point, I mean, like, who's really in charge there? Because, I mean, granted, I mean, there was the whole thing of, you know, like, the advisors and stuff like that, they translate whatever the orders are to those below them to actually do the stuff that's wanted, so... I mean, when you get to that point, at what point does the leader, you know, stop being a leader and just becomes like a figurehead?
Revolution theory is, by which I mean what color revolution theory really is. It's supposed to refer to a series of pro-democratic revolutions that happened between the year of 2000 and today, specifically in Serbia, Georgia, Adjara, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Armenia, Belarus, and the various Arab nations caught up in the wave of the Arab Spring. But here's the thing. There still exists considerable debate in academic circles if or not the term color revolution even means anything.
Yeah, where does the name color, where does the color come from?
Out of all the revolutions referred to as a color revolution, other than them being revolutions, the only thing which binds any of these together is the fact they happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the internet may have played some role, but tools of mass communication typically often play roles in revolutions. A key role of the French Revolution in 1789 was played by newspapers. So is the French Revolution a color revolution?
Red, the blood of angry men. Black, the dark of ages past.
In actuality, no.
Well, I mean, colors.
It's not allowed to be, because color revolution is almost an undefined term. Even Wikipedia cannot agree on what exactly it means, describing them as protests that resulted in regime change, which is literally the definition of every revolution in history.
Ever, yes.
Originally, the definition had been any revolution in a post-Soviet state with the intention of establishing democracy. But then the Arab Spring happened, which many consider to be a color revolution, and Russian propaganda has spent a considerable amount of effort attempting to convince everyone that the CIA was behind it all. But none of the Arab states are former Soviet states, so that part of the definition had to be dropped. But if a color revolution is just any revolution to bring about democracy, then the American Revolution of 1765
was a color revolution,
revolution. a red, white, and blue color revolution, and that can't be allowed, so the definition within the age of the internet now has to be added to limit the timescale. But that opens up a new can of worms, because now all the anti-communist revolutions of the 1980s and all the attempted anti-communist uprisings and protests that took place in the wake of the death of Stalin can now no longer be described as color revolutions. But the events of January the 6th can. After all, the protesters' end goal was, well, democracy. They genuinely believed their votes were rigged, and they were the ones defending democracy against subversion. And this attitude had been cultivated by, well, the internet, and the media personalities they had been watching on the internet, and the CIA had nothing to do with it. So now the definition has to be changed again. This time it's not democracy we're establishing, it's Western-style democracy. Though this is probably coming from George Bush Jr.'s use of the term by which he claimed that everything pro-democratic was a color revolution because Western democracy is inevitable. Of course, by that he meant the Purple Revolution, also known as the Iraq War. That was a revolution. It wasn't an invasion. Silly newspapers making stuff up again. You can never trust the mainstream media.
So I know. Okay. Oh god. I know LazerPig's doing his best to actually, explain what this is, but I'm going to be completely honest. I am just as confused as to what a color revolution is now after that entire explanation as I was at the beginning, and I think that's, just proving LazerPig's point.
Can you? The thing is, it's very tempting to sit here and argue what the exact definition of Western democracy or a color revolution is, but let's not beat around the bush. A color revolution is just whatever revolution that exists in the world and in history that Putin and those who think like him believe is the fault of the CIA. As such, the definition of what exactly is a color revolution has to keep being changed so that the end goal, proving it's all a CIA op, remains intact. It's kind of like claiming that all birds are evil, and you can prove it because all birds fly, and all flying things are evil. And if someone points out the existence of birds that don't fly, you simply state, well, those aren't birds, because all birds fly. Well, what about flying fish? Well, those have scales, and birds don't have scales. Are you stupid or something? Flying fish, what a moron.
Oh god, circular logic, you gotta love it.
You're not finding the common connection between everything and using that as the basis of the conclusion. You're starting with the conclusion you want and omitting anything which disproves it, and also distracts from the fact that you've made the connection between flying and evil and refuse to explain. But that's the thing, that connection never needs to be made. The connection is taken on faith that it's there. If it can't be found, it's not because it doesn't exist, it's because you fail to find it. That connection can never be proven to not exist, because color revolution theory is not an academic or a scientific study, it's a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory that has been painted with the veneer of just enough clever-sounding scientific woo-woo terminology to give it the air of legitimacy, so that you go into it already believing that the foundation work, that all things that fly are evil, has already been concluded by serious experts. So the end bit, the CIA is responsible, is the only bit you're allowed to question. And of course, if you're willing enough to go along with that, you'll be guided onto the correct conclusion, because if you dig enough into any revolution or any major political event throughout the world in the past 100 years, you will inevitably find some trace of America. America is a global superpower with its fingers in many pies. So in almost every major event within history post the Second World War, you will find some link back to the United States, and to color revolution theorists, that's all they need, because we know the CIA is involved, so the presence of any trace of America, regardless of how vague, can be used as evidence of CIA involvement. A random American in the crowd, an American tourist who happens to be ex-military, photographed getting off a plane, a phone call to the American ambassador, communication activity within the American embassy, to the Papa John's nearest Langley getting a little busier than usual, are all things that have been used as evidence of CIA involvement in any revolution.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Color.
I remember. Oh, I forget what it was, which it was, but yeah, there was the Papa John's that would always get really busy right before like an invasion or something, and after that became public, I believe they've had to diversify where they get their pizzas from, so not just one pizza chain gets like like a massive spike of business.
This is research through the method of Wiki Hitler. You can go to any article in Wikipedia and just by clicking hyperlinks get to Hitler. This is because any page can be linked to a country, and almost every country in the world had some involvement in World War II. Like the cultural Marxism crowd, they found the link to the people they want to blame, and thus no further thought is required. The idea that 18 million Americans will go through military service within their lifetime, and those who do typically gain more interest in traveling abroad, or the fact that any embassy would probably send and receive a lot more communications if a revolution was happening within the borders that they were based, or that pizza joints typically do get busier on a Friday night, are all irrelevant facts there to distract you. The bottom line is, the CIA is involved, and this proves it. As I said in my video on the Challenger, most of us in this community have never lived under communism, neither its rule nor its threat. But for Eastern Europe, communism wasn't a theory or some fun rebellious thing that edgy teenagers believe in, it was reality. I cannot convey what it was like for people to live under communism. But what I will say is I've met people who have lived under communism, and the mental scars of that time still exist. A friend of mine who is a folklore historian has traveled to many places in Eastern Europe where the scars of those memories are very present. In one incident, he recalls showing a group of people in a village in Hungary a rather silly comedy show about communist bureaucracy, and this was enough to apparently reopen some very, very deep wounds. Communism is only remembered fondly by those who lived at the very top during its reign and who benefited from their positions. And of course, people who have never lived through it and simply see it as a positive through the lens of capitalism bad.
Oh god, yeah. I mean, I have family who's lived through communism, and I've met them. When we went to my little brother, he's adopted. We went to Lithuania to adopt him, and this was in the year 2000. So that was what, like 5 years after the curtain fell? When did the Berlin Wall come down? 1998. So yeah, there's that. And Lithuania got their independence 1992, if I remember correctly. Let me double check that. 1990. Yeah, there you go. So that was 10 years. Still a little different, but still the same thing. And when I loved it there. We got to see castles, got to see family that I haven't seen since, unfortunately. But you could see it. We rented an apartment while we were there, and thinking back, it was very obviously, well, of course, like a Soviet era, concrete block, 4 sides on a central courtyard. It was really sad. And there was a time when one of my mom's cousins, they lived on a farm, and so they didn't leave it very often, but my mom actually took them to an all-you-can-eat buffet that had opened up recently. And my uncle, I guess you could call him, he ate so much that he was sick for a couple of days afterwards. Just from eating so much. It was he just not used to it. And just thinking back to that, granted, of course, as he said, I've never lived under communism. I never really lived under the threat of the Soviet Union. But just seeing how, what that does to a person like that, that's why, I live in Canada. We're, a more socialist country in some aspects. And I will always gladly support those, socialistic tendencies, to help people. But I would never support full-on communism. Never. Not in a million years. Just because of what I know my family has gone through.
And therefore synthesize the narrative that communism bad must come from capitalist propaganda and can therefore be ignored. Statistically, at least half of you started thinking that the second you realized where this chapter was going. But you're immune to propaganda, ain't ya? To those who actually lived under communism, it was a nightmare. The protests that came from the collapse of the Berlin Wall in '88 and later the total collapse of the Soviet Union in places like Poland and Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, and Lithuania were not the cause of a power vacuum left in the wake of the death of an empire, but the celebration of its passing. The satellite states of the Soviet Union, those who suffered the most and were stripped bare in order to serve the needs of Moscow, had the most to celebrate. Their joy at the death of communism and the independence that finally came with it are celebrations that go unmatched in history. They are overwhelming in their positivity and hope for the future. That to lapse back into the grasp of dictators, to be pulled away from that vision of a Western-style life with its promises of not only freedom, but in general a better life for your children, are so overwhelming that to feel it would never happen so long as your incompetent government continues to produce Stalin wannabe dictators who operate behind the illusion of democracy but always seem to retain power regardless of how much they mess everything up, is enough to cause a population to, well, take a more proactive approach to the term democracy. The desire for your children to grow up in a world better than the one you knew is one of the fundamental beliefs of every parent on the planet, and one of the few things that unites all of humanity. The reason why God, country, family is such an effective way of manipulating people is because when the world becomes too overwhelming, the average person retreats back to what is important to them, which is their personal morals, the place they live, and their family. And so long as nothing is directly affecting those three things, then they will rarely go out of their way to care about anything else outside of that scope. A lot of people couldn't give two shits about children dying in other countries, but when it's your family who is under threat, that's when the knives come out. And that's what's actually happening in these revolutions. People who thought they were progressing towards a better life suddenly find out that they're not. And not only are they facing a lifetime of gradually declining living standards under some asshole, but so are their children. The wall has come down, and they have been exposed to the potential of a better life and a better way of doing things. And the idea that the hardship they suffer is required to protect them against the corruption of the West no longer flies. They've seen the corruption of the West, and they want to be part of it, because it's better than being part of the corrupt East. Every single revolution currently described as a color revolution was against a corrupt dictator in favor of actual democracy, not the feudalism disguised as democracy that they'd always lived under. That's not something that is unique to any of the color revolutions, that's just what a revolution typically is. They are largely, throughout history, about overthrowing tyrants. It's about a people who have lost all hope, and in desperation, they fight for what they believe is a better future for themselves and their children. And brightly dressed students beatboxing about Karl Marx, economic slavery, and role-playing as anarchists rarely has anything to do with it. I mean, yes, the phrase student movements do come up quite a lot in revolutions, but that is normally because students typically have a lot more free time to do things like protest. Trust me, when was the last time you didn't see a student protest happening? But the thing is, when you are a corrupt dictator in charge of a country, the idea that this is just a thing that happens in society is terrifying. So a cause has to be found, because it cannot be that your loyal sheep-like populace, who obviously love you, will seemingly at random just turn against you with little warning, and that's somehow your fault. There has to be some sort of external influence. And when you have fought your entire life against the dominance of the West, guess who's first in the pipeline to be blamed?
The West, of course,
of course. Color revolution theory are technically onto something, but to them the theory is just a way of simplifying the complexity of the world around them in such a way so that they are never to blame. Instead, the blame is deflected towards a singular shadowy group or authority who could theoretically be capable of it, that can be opposed and fought against with a singular and, most importantly, simple solution, which can be whatever you want it to be. More money for the military, 9 p.m. curfews, restrictions on immigration and foreign work visas, a big wall, kill every pregnant cat. It's up to you. And the best part about this whole thing is because it's a shadow organization, everyone bad is in theory working for them. The murderers and thieves behind your skyrocketing crime rate, the corrupt politicians, the aid workers that make you look bad in the news, the farmers who just couldn't supply the entire country's grain when all their farmhands were sent off to join the military, and even the weather itself are all CIA agents.
The weather,
and if you torture anyone for long enough, they will absolutely admit that this is all true. This completes the illusion that Putin is never to blame for any unrest within Russia's own borders. The fact that Putin lives in a $1.6 billion palace that reportedly has its own private casino and toilets made from solid gold, while 48% of his population, or 70 million people, do not have access to an indoor toilet, has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that there might be some people in Russia who believe that their current system is a bit unfair. No, it's all a CIA plot. This makes it easier to think about. There's a clear us versus them narrative now, an enemy to unite everyone against, focus all our attention on, and take the blame for anything bad that happens. And no one needs to sit down with Putin and explain the complexities of a public engineering works. And that's what color revolution theory is. That's what it really is. It might seem weird that someone who can climb to the point where they are in charge of an entire country could be fooled by something so idiotic as a conspiracy
what was I talking
theory,
about that
but
earlier?
this is the unfortunate reality of being a dictator. As I said right back at the start of this chapter, they live in cultures of paranoia, carefully protected from reality by the illusionary gold leaf world of wealth and power that they construct around themselves. That bubble is built to protect them, and the thing they seek the most protection from is the idea that they don't actually know what they are doing. Like I said, dictators don't tend to be great stewards of the economy. They are historically terrible leaders, they act on impulse, and they act on ego, and they fuck everything up. The other great elephant in the room we should address is any of this actually true? Even if we assume it's not the CIA behind it all, many people would be in agreement that even if there is no evidence for it anywhere, it's very possible that an organization like the CIA could trigger a coup in a country, and it's probably happened before. So ignoring the example I gave earlier where I showed the
where it
CIA
failed,
does not have anywhere close to that kind of power and has operated almost entirely on luck and economically enslaving a dictator by supplying them with weapons, supplies, and the money that they need to live the life of luxury they think they deserve, while brutally imposing their regime and occasionally reminding them that if they don't do what Uncle Sam tells them, then all of that goes away. Which is what happened in the late 80s and early 90s in South America, where the West began to withdraw funding from places like Chile, and their dictatorial governments gradually collapsed, which might be another reason we're seeing so many anti-dictator revolutions in our lifetime, since their existence is no longer beneficial to the superpowers which kept them in power. But ignoring that, is something like color revolution theory possible? Well, no, it's not. You'd be right to think there are governments and institutions out there with...
Granted, he's talked a lot in this video about it. So, I mean, just the simple answer of no seems kind of a bit anticlimactic. But again, I mean, the world has so many moving pieces in it. I mean, and of course you can manipulate people. But, I mean, that only goes so far. So, yeah, I can definitely see it as it being solidly in the no category.
Massive influences over your life who are probably trying to manipulate you. And that is a conversation that is important to have. But the disappointing reality is that these institutions generally don't have the power to point at a country and go, "New regime, please." And the reasons why are deeply complicated. It would take a long time to explain, and the reason why this video, which I started editing back in January, is so late, is because I initially wrote a script attempting to explain all the reasons it doesn't work.
Okay, that's why.
162 pages. The words of a great internet legend.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
So, to be brief, like I promised I would be, but, que sera, sera.
Yeah.
Things like cultural
It was still
manipulation,
25 minutes left.
interestingly, follow the same rules as hypnosis. Now, it's gonna seem a bit crazy, but let me explain. Hypnosis doesn't work if you know you are being hypnotized. Or to be more precise, you cannot be hypnotized against your will. And even if you are being willfully hypnotized, you cannot be made to do something that you don't want to do. You have to want to do it to be made to do it. Cultural manipulation works the same. If you know you are being manipulated, it doesn't work. It only works if you want it to. If you want the things it is saying to be real, then you're more likely to believe it. You're less likely to be skeptical, and you're less likely to do research. This is why manipulative propaganda always tells you what you want to hear. Again, God.
Washington said we needed to follow Christ, or we're never going to succeed as a nation.
The founders were overwhelmingly of the Christian faith, following Jesus Christ, a carpenter.
That God created this nation, that He wrote the Constitution, that it's based on biblical principles.
Jesus loves you. Why doesn't the government vote yes?
Country.
Under President Trump, America is stronger, safer, and more prosperous than ever before.
You imagine putting your life on the line in Afghanistan and having just a leisure time and wanting to watch a football game and seeing your players, your American players, disrespect the country and the flag on foreign soil? Can you?
Okay, oh god, that's bringing back so many memories. That was another thing. The whole thing, you know, the kneeling to the flag sort of deal. How is kneeling disrespectful? Granted, I mean, this might be just coming from me because as I've said in previous videos, I'm a Boy Scout. That any time you go up a level and you get a new tie and stuff like that, you'd bring out the flag, you'd kneel, and you'd kiss it. That's just part of what we did before you tie the knot. You get your tie, you tie the knot to remind you to do a good deed every day, and then it's brought back out again. What was with the whole thing that kneeling is apparently a sign of disrespect? I never got that.
Family.
Posted thousands of wild posters asking the delegates on the Commission on the Status of the Women to stand for life and family values.
So with a family of 10, it gets a little crazy. So we have some pretty simple rules in our house. Clean your room.
No teenage boys in your bedroom.
And no lying.
Especially to the FBI. For us, it's all about family.
2016年12月，在会见第一届全国文明家庭代表时，习近平总书记语重心长地讲道：“
家庭是人生的第一课堂，父母是孩子的第一任老师。有什么样的家教，就有什么样的人。”
There is sufficient evidence that Wagner's Internet Research Agency was involved in the American culture war, because if you keep getting told what you want to hear, that your enemies are vulgar and stupid, and of course the real Nazis, and obviously you're better than them and on the right side of history, which is what everyone wants to hear, I'm right and the people who disagree with me are just idiots, it's not that I'm wrong, absolutely not, then you can gradually be convinced that the things you care about are under threat from those people, and slowly recruited into a cause which appears, even if superficially, to support your concerns. In reality, they just paint a giant target on the head of anyone they don't like and tell you that they are the real enemy, and abuse cult-like attitudes to keep you angry enough that you'll never stop to question yourself, and anyone who tries to point all this out is clearly an agent of the conspiracy, and blah blah blah, so on and so forth. The final rule of hypnotism is it doesn't work on everyone, and people build up an immunity to it over time. Even if Wagner was, and likely still is, involved in the culture war, Gamergate was over 10 years ago. The actual culture war, the Great Revolution, never came. You could maybe look at January the 6th and probably see that as the end result Wagner were looking for, but in terms of revolutions, January the 6th was a wet fart, and by the end of the day the people involved weren't digging trenches or setting up roadblocks or laying mines, preparing to defend themselves against the US Army's response, even though the majority of those involved are the kind of people who proudly own multiple firearms and scream loudly from the rooftops about how the right to bear arms means the government can never fully take away their freedom, and they will fight anyone who disagrees. On the day, the actual day where they had the opportunity to do that, they all went home, they all went back to work, and by now, most of them don't even remember it. Everyone might want the Great Civil War in America because they feel overwhelmed by all the crap they see in the news and feel the simplest solution is to simply wipe the slate clean and start again. But outside of a few pockets of extremists, no one really feels the need to be part of it. They just want it to happen in the background, done by, other, more prepared people who know what they're doing when it comes to that sort of thing.
Yeah, they want others to do it so they don't have to be involved. Yes. Oh, God. Oh, God. I mean, you gotta love no matter what the message is, the most powerful force in the universe is just being lazy. You gotta love it.
They more envision themselves being part of the world that will be rebuilt once it's over, not the people who will be living out in the wilderness for 5 years, digging trenches and getting shot at and hunted by drones, trying to make it happen. Now, none of this means that any of the stuff the Internet Research Agency and various other similar establishments within Russia, China, and Iran don't work. They do, and it's admittedly kind of scary to see how far their influence reaches within Western society and how few people seem to be willing to take it seriously, but their end goal of manipulating people into overthrowing their governments is not a feasible task. And it's very likely that what they started to realize is something like that, even if it were possible, would take generations to achieve, far beyond the expected remaining lifetime of all those aging reptiles. You know what's easier? Finding some idiot who desires wealth and power and supplying them with enough money and drugs until they are in power and threatening to take it all away unless he dances to the tune they play. But what do I know? I'm just a silly British person. But if you want more evidence of why color revolution theory is impossible, then this is exactly what Putin has been trying to do in Ukraine for the past 30 years.
Jeez, we're finally getting onto this point. Oh, God.
Controls of social media, controls of mass media, use of cultural displays, influence in elections, the use of immigration to targeted sectors to dilute the culture there with Russian, programs aimed at economic stability, programs aimed at encouraging corruption within the ranks of the government, a series of bribes and threats against those in power, and even a government-funded militia organization, and finally, a full-blown invasion have all been Putin's attempts to replicate what he thinks the CIA have been doing to trigger the world's color revolutions, and for 30 years, it has utterly failed to work. The playbook has remained largely unchanged in all that time. Ukraine is full of Nazis. The government wants to eradicate the Russian population within Ukraine's borders, ban the Orthodox Church, and ban the Russian language, which in 30 years it still hasn't gotten around to doing, outside of changing a few road signs and deciding that Ukraine's national language is Ukrainian. And for those in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine who were under the full power of this information war, even as they were being armed and conscripted into resistance armies, rather than rebel, simply voted in a person from eastern Ukraine who spoke their language and would look out for their interests. They voted in Zelensky. Putin has attempted time and time again to trigger a civil war within the borders of Ukraine in the hopes that when he invaded, it could be done under the guise of bringing stability to the region, making him the good guy. He honestly believed that Ukrainians would see Russia as liberators, that they would approach Russian tanks with bread and salt, the traditional gifts. Instead, they had stones thrown at them, were spat at, and told to go home. And Putin is left confused, because Putin lives in the magical, whimsical land of the Kremlin's bubble. His orders were being translated to the Duma through his advisors, but through the same people, reality was being translated back to Putin. His advisors were cherry-picking the best examples of what was going on to create the narrative that Putin's plans were working, and he believed them. This got to the point where mere months prior to the invasion, the Kremlin was ordered to produce a report that claimed that Ukrainians were largely pro-Russian and would not resist an invasion, simply as part of a political exercise. But that report was handed to Putin to save his advisors' asses from having to explain why his grand plan wasn't working, and Putin believed it. He invaded not because he wanted more warm water ports or natural resources. He invaded because he genuinely believed he was on the verge of triggering a color revolution within Ukraine. And yet, regardless of how hard he tries, Ukraine resists him. He's now in his 3rd year of his 3-day special military operation.
Oh god, yeah. The 3-day special military operation. I completely forgot that's what this was called at the beginning. Oh god. This whole thing. I mean, if this... I swear, if it ever actually does come to light through, like, declassified documents, through like, interviews and stuff like that, where, like, this conspiracy theory is actually proven to be, like, 100% true, that Putin invaded Ukraine because because his own subordinates were feeding him false information to save their own butts. Oh god, I guarantee you, that will spawn an entire new generation of Russian bureaucratic comedy films and like in media and stuff like that, because I just can't even.
And Ukraine is still resisting him, and Ukraine is overwhelmingly in favor of continuing this resistance. In fact, they are angry at NATO for not supplying them with enough ammunition fast enough so that they can resist even harder. Even if Russia wants to win this war, Ukraine will continue to resist him. A Russian-backed puppet government would likely be overthrown immediately, and a fully annexed Ukraine would likely lead to generations of armed resistance, terrorist attacks, and instability. But Putin will not back down, because in Putin's mind, Putin cannot be wrong. And if color revolution theory doesn't in fact work, then all the efforts he has made into recreating it will have been for nothing. Because you can bet your ass Ukraine is not the only country they have been trying this on. You'd be amazed just how much money certain groups in America, especially those who favor isolationist policies, receive that can be traced back to Russia, with most of it coming via crypto. I've seen it myself in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. Russia-backed money found its way into the pro-independence movement. Russia bots were highly active on pro-independence discussion boards and Twitter, especially Facebook, and Russia Today was the only alternative media present at major events. The former leader of the pro-independence movement, Alex Salmond, even got his own show on Russia Today. Sputnik even attempted to set up offices in Scotland's capital of Edinburgh during the event. The attempt here was to push the narrative that an independent Scotland should not join NATO, as well as spark outrage among the Scottish population over a nuclear submarine base in Fastlane, and that an independent Scotland should seek to remove this base, Britain's only naval base capable of hosting nuclear submarines. I wonder if there are some clues as to Russia's end goal here, because the same might have been happening in the Brexit campaign. 8.4 million, the biggest ever single donation to a political cause in British history, came from a man who had close ties to the Russian government, Aaron Banks, shortly after meeting with the Russian ambassador to Britain and a Russian spy who was a member of the GRU, a Russian military intelligence agency. Also present at the meeting was Andy Wickmore, member of the UK Independence Party. Yes, that party. It is alleged that he promised the Russian ambassador he could get him close to Nigel Farage, the Brexit campaign's loudest member and proud campaigner of British isolationism, who was supposedly given over $500,000 to appear on Russia Today, where he was knighted by a schoolchild. The investigation into these incidents and to Russian interference in the Brexit campaign as a whole were scrapped by then Prime Minister Theresa May over fears that it would trigger a second Brexit referendum. Whether MI5 continued the investigation regardless has never been made public. Perhaps now you see the narrative in hindsight, but the British public back in 2014 and 2016 certainly did not. And even if they did, no one cared, because whatever Russia was doing, it helped them out. It fit their narrative, and Russia could always be dealt with later. Right? I mean, it wasn't that severe. The whole thing sounds like a conspiracy theory anyway, and no one's going to believe it. Besides, Putin is our friend. It's not like he's actually going to invade Europe. It is rumored that contracts for gold and diamond mining in Russia were waved around to many British politicians, including one Boris Johnson, who dined with Evgeny Lebedev, son of Russian oligarch Alexander Lebedev, former KGB agent and one of Putin's closest friends, or at least at the time, just before deciding to back the Brexit campaign. Of course, none of these contracts ever materialized, if they were even real to begin with. Either way, Evgeny Lebedev in 2020 became a life member of the British House House of Lords, meaning he has voting rights on whatever British laws come into power. He was nominated by Boris Johnson.
How do you get life to... Oh, God. I'm going to have to look that up, because
Calls to make public the government's security concerns over this were voted in by Parliament, but these documents have still yet to be declassified. Was Putin doing the same to America? Possibly. YouTube commentators were trying to convince everyone for years that there was no Russian interference in the US elections. But there was. Oddly enough, these were the same YouTube commentators who were trying to convince you that Brexit was a good idea, that the EU was corrupt, push isolationist policies disguised as anti-globalism, as well as anti-immigration policies, support Trump, that the behaviors of dictators are refreshing and should be celebrated, that Ukraine is full of Nazis, and that the liberals are stupid, and of course that Antifa are the real Nazis. Now,
I'm gonna open myself up here for a little bit, but I think about. I cringe a lot, but there was a time when I unironically actually watched Sargon of Akkad. But the thing is, at this point, I can't even remember why I was watching, or like what were the videos specifically. It was probably thinking about it. It was probably about something that I found like. I was getting annoyed at with like somebody on the extreme left or something like that, and he made a couple of videos that, mimicked my thought process at the time. Well, at least on the one thing, you can say that as long as you cringe at your past self, you are improving, so...
Now, I'm not suggesting there is any link here, because, well, there is a term in the study of propaganda called the useful idiot, and, well, I'll let you gather your own conclusions.
Right, yeah, definitely.
Here's what I'm hinting at. Russia bot farms were set up specifically to learn the attitudes of and manipulate certain demographics of the American population. Members of the Internet Research Agency were required to post or comment on around 50 news articles a day, maintain a minimum of 6 Facebook accounts, each posting 3 times daily, with at least 2 of those posts discussing news articles. Facebook was their major hunting ground at the time. They set up thousands of legit-looking local news websites, which generated real stories to earn credibility, while also pushing alternative stories that aligned with the Kremlin's narrative. And those stories would be pushed by the bots, whose fake interaction would be picked up by the algorithm and circulated out to people who, at a cursory glance, would appear to be reading something from a legit news source. Did they support Trump because they believed he would hand Ukraine to Putin on a silver platter, or at the very least keep America out of Europe's business? The actions of certain, coincidentally pro-Trump Republicans in America, as they do everything to delay further aid to Ukraine, seems to support this theory. But of course, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just a silly British boy. Was Putin's long-term goal to create a cultural revolution in Britain and America which supported pro-isolationist policies, leaving the 2 strongest armies in NATO basically inert? If America and Britain didn't care what was happening in Europe, and Germany was too pacifist and too eager for that cheap oil and gas deal, and France continued to never do anything unless it had to, then who was going to stop Putin basically doing what he wanted? And if there was a series of pro-Russian revolutions across Eastern Europe, then who was to blame him for bringing stability to the region? After all, everyone in the West was so ready to believe that the EU was corrupt and that Eastern Europe was doing so poorly under it, and they all wanted out of it so badly that naturally they'd want to go back to the glory days of the Soviet Union. It was a master plan, a brilliant plan. The problem was, it was complete bollocks. The EU didn't collapse, Britain somewhat regrets Brexit, Germany is rearming, and even under Trump, America still wholly doesn't support isolationism, especially when there's an ass it can kick. And even if there was a growing pro-Russian sentiment across Eastern Europe, there isn't now. Putin is not as intelligent as he thinks he is. I have to take back what I said earlier. He's an idiot. And he's surrounded by an increasing number of idiots who have been Pavloved into referring to his declining mental state as genius, because in the walls of the Kremlin, you must swear fealty to the king. You've been gaslit into thinking Putin is brilliant, or maybe even was brilliant back in his day, politically speaking, but it was the people who surrounded Putin, the Yeltsin old guard, his political machinists, his oligarchs, his former KGB members and bankers that masterminded his rise to power and kept him there. He was chosen because he was considered to be young, liberal. It was thought he would be a steady hand on the economy and guide Russia through a new period of uncertainty, as well as subtly cancel all those nasty investigations into Yeltsin's accounts. Whereas in reality, his KGB agents masterminded cases against anyone who could politically threaten him for power, most notably one Sergei Pugachev, coincidentally the richest man in Russia and holder of many of the Kremlin's inner secrets and knowledge of how Putin came to power, as well as owner of a number of military shipyards which were later sold off to Putin's closest friends at a fraction of their value. Now that would be a video all in itself, but the important part you need to know is Pugachev became the scapegoat to oust the old guard of the Russian Republic, Yeltsin's former elite, and usher in a new age where everything was state-controlled, and Putin could dictate wealth, who became an oligarch and who didn't, filling its ranks with his closest friends and KGB partners. He took everything. He tied the Russian economy directly to the price of oil, and as it skyrocketed, he used the money to transform himself into a god. Positions of state became ways to become billionaires. His new inner circle became nothing but parasites to feed on the wealth he generated, where none of it was fed back into the country. Moscow and St. Petersburg became awash with high-rise apartments, foreign-made cars, and bougie cafes, but for the average Russian, nothing changed. Vatniks and pro-Russian sympathizers can go to Komsomolskaya metro station and show off its marble pillars and chandeliers all they want. The vast majority of Russians do not live in the great mighty Russian Federation. They live in the corpse of the Soviet Union. But Putin's problem is he's running out of friends. For years, he used capitalism as a method of waging war against the West. London became his biggest target, as I mentioned in the Challenger 2 video. In fact, the problem became so widespread that locals still refer to London as Londongrad. But while it's all well and good to corrupt Britain with huge amounts of cash, Britain is not exactly a stranger to huge amounts of cash, and the people who flaunt huge amounts of cash. The upper tiers of almost the entirety of the British political structure are awash with old money, people who can trace their lineage back to medieval knights and lords, and who consider 80 grand a year a peasant's wage. No joke, this is a country where in 2009, a Member of Parliament Douglas Hogg, 3rd Viscount Helsham, Baron Helsham of Kellythrope, Douglas Martin Hall, was ousted for a £2,000 expenses claim to clean the moat of his estate. The moat! And this is hardly an isolated example. This is a country where foreigners trying to take advantage of the British by throwing around huge amounts of wealth and expecting the aristocracy to dance for them is so commonplace in British history, it has become ingrained into their very culture. And the Russians are not the richest nor the most powerful group to attempt this. For all the attention the Russians receive manipulating the British system to their needs, you'd have to be incredibly naive to think the Brits were not doing exactly the same back to the Russians. And Putin's problem was the Brits were better at it than he is. Secret tapes of various oligarch meetings in London were recorded by the FSB and later seized by SO15, Britain's counter-terrorism unit. They revealed that, though the Kremlin's influence in London was everywhere, the culture of backstabbing and paranoia the oligarchs were used to was absent. Here in London, they no longer needed to lie. They no longer needed to watch their backs. They didn't need to be suspicious of every single person who said hello. They could make friends. They could be honest with people. They could finally talk about what was on their mind and have the ear of someone who wouldn't use that information against them. In London, the oligarchs experienced something they had never experienced before. They were happy. The problem for Putin was that his oligarchs were becoming anglicized. London wasn't their second home, it was their home. And this sort of loosened his control over them. Though most of them have remained silent, 15,000 of Russia's millionaires, billionaires, and oligarchs have requested either migration or political asylum within the UK's borders. Those that have spoken out, such as Oleg Tinkov, have been widely pro-Ukrainian and warned that no negotiation which concedes Ukrainian land to Russia should be tolerated. What's worse is, as this war has dragged on, Putin's paranoia has increased. 52 of Russia's oligarchs have died under mysterious circumstances, some apparently having committed suicide, others mysteriously falling out of windows. A large number of Putin's advisors who kept the Kremlin bubble intact have either been arrested, been sacked, or been found dead. And now the bubble is starting to collapse. Putin is starting to see glimpses of reality for perhaps the first time in his life, and this sudden realization that everything isn't going according to his plan has left him floundering.
Okay, sorry, I had to let it running. I'm sorry, I had to let it run there just so I could really get. I love the idea that a portion of why Putin's plan may have failed is just because, like, the places he was trying to manipulate was genuinely a better place than where it was just a genuinely better place than Russia. Oh god, it sounds stupid, and it almost sounds like, a poorly written, like, sci-fi story or a spy thriller or something like that, but I absolutely love that. That is just awesome.
He's exposed, and the only thing he can do is just keep scapegoating and killing off the people around him in the hopes that everyone else stays in line and no one else thinks that maybe, just maybe, it's all his fault. Because even if he was a hyper-intelligent manipulator and political chess player that the media has always portrayed him as, the skills required to do that do not transfer to the implementation and management of a global conspiracy. Because that's all color revolution theory is. It's a conspiracy theory. And like all conspiracy theories, it promotes the idea that a series of completely unrelated and often random elements are under the direct control of a shadow organization that no one's ever seen. Because it makes it easier to contextualize and think about. The idea that no one is in control of all this, that there is no intelligence behind it all, no thing with a thought process or a moral structure dishing out punishments based on some grand master plan, that things just happen and there is no grand plan behind it all, there is no conspiracy, is to many people truly frightening. And in a nutshell, that's basically it. The invasion of Ukraine is the end result of a failed attempt by Russia to entice a pro-Russian rebellion within eastern Ukraine. And now that rebellion didn't happen, they are faced fighting an attrition war for no real reason against a population that neither wants nor supports their presence. And this will continue because their idiot of a president believed a conspiracy theory and is now too proud and stubborn to admit that it didn't work. And everything has just ballooned far beyond his control. He has no plan. He has no idea what to do, so he'll just keep grinding more lives against the millstone until he either throttles some sort of victory out of the situation or loses everything completely. And that's the reality of this war. There is no method to the madness. There is no grand master plan. Putin is not lining up all his chess pieces to make some brilliant big move. He's already made his move. And this is the result. Anyway, if you liked it...
What the bloody hell are you doing in my sitting room?
Ah! It's not because of Brexit, it's not because of Brexit.
Oh, God. I mean, I guess that's just, the wave of emotion and stuff like that. But, I mean, there were parts of that where I was genuinely starting to get sad and angry. And I was... I mean, I'll have to see how it comes across in the video, but... I was generally starting to feel like maybe a little sick just as LazerPig just got deeper and deeper into it. But then he started talking about how this might have been... All of this was caused by Putin being a conspiracy theorist and all of this failing. And again, the whole thing with, like... or with the oligarchs changing side just because the other places in the world were just nicer places to live rather than Russia. I can't. It was absolutely beautiful. I reiterate my point once again. If something like it comes out confirming this, like some declassified document or something, I guarantee you that it will spawn a new, more modern wave of like Russian political comedy, just because. It's because of how absolutely absurd it is. I just can't. So yeah, I mean, that's going to be it for now. So of course, as always, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, as well as the first part of this video. And with all that out of the way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.